One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. And even if there are only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
You are, of course, one of the most controversial figures we've had in the Senate in a long time. And you have the distinction of having coined a new word for the dictionary, namely McCarthyism. Now, how do you define McCarthyism, sir?
Apparently, McCarthyism means calling a man a communist who is later proven to be one.
Well, I remember the McCarthy period when I was in college. That's when it started, and the McCarthyism was so powerful, and it affected everything because the Korean War was going on. And in 1952, McCarthy was the dominant figure in American life. He was the most powerful person in American public life.
At this instant, the Imperial German government secretly financed the return to Russia of 7 communist exiles led by Nikolai Lenin, exiles who had been forced to flee the country. And in 100 days, those 7 communists were literally the masters of Russia.
I think he was sort of a populist politician who latched onto an issue and found it ran away with him.
If there were no communists in our government, why did we delay for 18 months, delay our research on the hydrogen bomb, even though our intelligence agencies were reporting day after day that the Russians were feverishly pushing their development of the H-bomb? And I ask you, who caused it? Was it loyal Americans or was it traitors in our government?
He learned the advantages of the big lie. You don't tell a little lie, nobody cares. You don't say, I think that there's a suspicious man at the grocery store. You say the State Department is full of Russian communists. The army is infiltrated by communists. You make big lies, and that's what he instinctively understood.
Isn't that nasty McCarthy an awful man?
Oh, yes. Basically everything you've ever heard about McCarthy, you just have to hit the delete button on. It's stunning, all the lies that are out there. I mean, there are high school history books, and their entire summary of McCarthy is he was a liar. Not just an ordinary liar, a big liar, a huge liar, a total liar.
You know, if he was half as bad as they claim he is, I'd have never worked for the guy. I've been an honorable man. I was an FBI agent. I was an honorable guy. I was in the military. I wouldn't work for a guy if he was that bad that they say he was.
You learn early in life that you don't go skunk hunting with striped trousers, a silk handkerchief, and a top hat. We like what you are trying to do, but, oh, we don't like your methods. I have heard that over and over and over like a broken phonograph record. We're engaged now in digging out a much smellier breed of animal than I dug out back on the farm.
I looked at the senator as a little old farm boy from Wisconsin. And you know, they say you can take the little boy away from the farm, but you never take the farm away from the boy. And he was just a big grown-up farmer.
Oh, Appleton, boy, where do you start? I'm a hometown boy. I married a hometown girl and stayed home. And this is a wonderful community to raise a family, make a living, religious community, very ground Midwest values.
That was like Pleasantville. It was homogeneous. There were no blacks. There was this unwritten law that they couldn't stay in town. You know, it was a great place if you happened to be white and, you know, of middle class. But if you weren't that, it wasn't the place for you.
McCarthy was a farm boy. The farm buildings are still there west of Appleton. One of several children born to a perfectly average, normal Catholic parents. I interviewed a brother, and the brother who looked just like him was perfectly normal and had spent his life as a manual laborer up in the area. And Joe might have too, except that Joe was really smart and aggressive and outgoing and good-looking and ambitious. He had it planned, he had it worked out to become a judge and then to move to the Senate, and the only way he could do that was through the Republican Party.
I was a combat correspondent with the Marine Corps, and I'd been a newspaperman before the war. And he said, hey, Penn, do you think that you could dream up some kind of a story when the war is over and I go into politics? And I said, Joe, there's an old rule in the newspaper business. You can't write a story about it if you don't do something. Now, you're sitting around here and you're a nice fellow, but you're not doing anything. And he came back to me a few days later, and I've been talking to my squadron leader, and he said that it would be okay for me to ride the rear seat in the dive bombers and to make some direct observations as an intelligence officer. I promised not to even try to shoot the gun so I don't shoot the tails off the plane. And I said, well, that sounds promising. Why don't you do it?
McCarthy, being a farmer, having been a young judge there, having been served in the military during World War II, he's in the Marine Corps. He falsified his record, but that's not the story entirely. But he did serve in the Pacific, so he came back as the war hero.
My mother was Senator Joe McCarthy's older sister. And I'm going to read a letter that he wrote to her. It was dated May 8th, 1944. And he was stationed in the South Pacific at the time as a captain in the U.S. Marines. Dear Sis, Romy tells me that you have quit your job to devote full time to the campaign. This was his first campaign for the U.S. Senate. You are really a jewel, Sis. I know things look like hell, but if only we can get out the 800,000 letters, I shall win by a landslide. They can't possibly beat us, Sis. If everyone in the state gets a letter and a folder.
Well, you know, Washington, D.C. is really a cruel town. It really is a cruel town. And Harry Truman, President Truman, once said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog.
After 2 years, he wasn't going anywhere, and he was in deep trouble of not being reelected.
He tried to make a name for himself. He got involved in housing after the war and tried to create some legislation that he could put his name on. Nothing seemed to work. There was a Red Scare going on, so from 1948 on at least, or you could see it in 46 growing. Joe didn't really pay any attention to it. He would call the occasional left-wing critic a commie. But everybody, you know, that was typical language in the Republican Party in those days, but he didn't get involved in it at all. And then he was invited to make a tour. And there he just gave some typical blowhard stuff in a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he said there were commies all over the State Department, 205 of them, and he knew their names. He didn't have any names. This was sheer nonsense. It was McCarthy's Irish bravado.
During this speech, his exact words were, right at this moment, right this instant, our government is being infiltrated by communists. He repeated it the second time, and the audience were just amazed. I don't think any of us in Wheeling ever heard the word communist before.
Right after he left Wheeling, He flew to a bunch of other little cities to give talks, and everywhere he went, the reporters were flocking around him saying, where's the documentation for 205 Reds in the State Department? Well, I left it in my briefcase in the plane. I mean, that's the kind of audacity that no one else had, let alone a United States senator. Nixon was too smart for such stuff.
The subject of communism was not on Joe McCarthy's screen before he became a politician. I think it became an issue that he identified as something that maybe would project him in the job as a United States Senator.
Best of my recollection, he looked me up. He was a freshman senator. He wanted publicity. He knew that the column was well read. There was a Republican policy meeting, a meeting that was supposed to be secret, a meeting that the newsmen were not supposed to know about. He'd put me on an extension, and he'd call Senator Robert Taft, the Republican leader, and senator to senator ask him what happened. And Robert Taft, thinking that he was talking to a fellow senator, would tell him what happened, and I would be able to get the entire story. He would tell me almost anything that I wanted to know.
Every reporter realized that he was not terribly serious about this, but using them, but they were perfectly willing to be used. It wasn't really motivated by a fear of communism, but by an attempt to use the fear and dislike of communism to destroy other people's civil liberties and to advance one's own career.
I am not, and never have been, a member of the Communist Party.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
I'm holding in my hand a microfilm of the most confidential, highly secret State Department documents. This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting these documents in reduced form to the Soviet Union.
Richard Nixon gets a lot of credit for the Alger Hiss hearings. Joe McCarthy had nothing whatsoever to do with Alger Hiss hearings. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the Hollywood 10. And I could go on and on. And without a doubt, whenever you talk about that issues, they tie it in with Joe McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy would not have succeeded had there not been threats to America, had there not been traitors within, had atomic secrets not been given away, had there not been a war in Korea, had the Chinese and the Russians not gathered together.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, the difference between Nixon, who, quote, got Alger Hiss, and Joe McCarthy. Nixon was a much more prudent man, much more careful man, particularly as he got along in his career, whereas Joe, that was not one of his major virtues.
Totally different. Nixon was, despite everything that is said about him, a man of a lot of intellectual quality. He was a politician who learned, against his nature, how to use public opinion.
Nixon was, in fact, the model for Joe McCarthy, but he wasn't the only one. The whole Republican Party had figured that they were going to come back to power by attacking the Democrats as being liberal, communistic, socialistic, and traitorous. That was their theme.
Some of the important members of the present administration, through stupidity or design, have coddled communists.
Thank you very much for the privilege of discussing with you this afternoon the great overshadowing evil which is the issue of 1952. Shall America continue to squander her blood, waste her resources, and sacrifice her position of world leadership? Now, this is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democrat issue. This, my good friends, is an American issue.
In his hysterical way, he provided the Soviet propaganda with great, tools to denounce America as a reactionary country, more and more turning towards fascism, American style. Actually, McCarthy was pictured as a new fascist in the United States.
But perhaps the most revealing article written by Stevenson's speechwriter appeared in the New York Times on December 11, 1949, on page 3, and listen to this if you will, and I quote, he says, I happen to believe that the Communist Party should be granted the freedom of political action and that communists should be allowed to teach in universities. Nothing secret, right?
With all his paranoia, let me tell you, well, he played a positive role for the United States because he alerted the American public in a very crazy way. He alerted the federal security agencies about the threats to the United States.
And then he exploited that around the country every single day. It made headlines, and he gave more headlines, and the charges, and they never caught up with the charges. He'd make a charge and go on to the next charge, and he'd escalate the charges. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, was a traitor, the Red Dean, and he escalated up to Harry Truman, the President of the United States.
And that was the beginning of popular television. We knew that at 11:15, the man that McCarthy was going to crucify was the victim of the day, because that would be in time for the film to be developed, flown to the headquarters of the networks, and be on the noon news.
We were reacting to whatever he said, and there was not a lot of investigation writing. It was just, he got the attention. That was it.
He was more popular than he should be, and it's very hard from this distance to understand why. I mean, I find it, as I talk to you now, to be, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, he was a little jerk.
He had accomplished his goal. It took him 3 years, but he did it. He immunized the middle class. He exposed the Democratic Party. He exposed a lot of these loyalty boards in the government and made it embarrassing for this sort of nonsense to keep going on. So, okay, they destroyed him. They spent the next 50 years building up a myth about the man, but he had done it. He saved America, and it was only another 20 years or so before Ronald Reagan came in and saved the world.
Ike rejoins his campaign train for a swing through the Midwest. It's obvious what Mamie thinks of Ike's whistle-stop manner, and the Wisconsin crowd seem to enjoy it, too.
During the campaign in 1952, Eisenhower would not even accept McCarthy's support, although McCarthy did support him. And there was a complete personal dislike for each other.
I spent about half an hour with the general last night. While I can't report that we agreed entirely on everything, I can report that when I left that meeting with the general, I had the same feeling as when I went in, and that is that he's a great American, will make a great president, an outstanding president.
The president had no use whatsoever for Senator McCarthy.
In universities.
They differed on political issues as well as other issues. Eisenhower did not take any leadership role to moderate the situation. I don't think the senator ever realized, nor would he have accepted any criticism that he was overstepping his responsibility.
Are you a member of the communist conspiracy as of this moment? Are you a member of the Communist Party as of today?
Were you then a member of the Communist Party?
McCarthy was not after spies. We have an FBI, we have other institutions to go after spies. You don't catch spies by calling and say, hey man, are you a spy? Please tell me.
What he did was he picked on minor people, and foolishly in many cases, and ruined some people's lives.
That's correct. You wrote a book in 32, is that correct?
Yes, I wrote a book. Mr. Chairman, this was 1932.
Yeah, I know that's 1932. Do you know that they since have been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party?
At the time I wrote the book, the atmosphere in the universities of the United States was greatly affected by the Great Depression then in existence.
Wait, I'm going to ask you this question again.
I resent the tone of this inquiry very much, Mr. Chairman, because it is my neck, my public neck, that you are very skillfully trying to wring.
There was a great deal of incompetence on the committee. The file system was in somewhat of a disarray, and several of the investigators had no experience whatsoever.
When I was on trial, I remember bumping into him in the courtroom corridor. He threw his arm around me and said, "Hello, Leo." And his whole attitude was, don't hold this against me personally. This is just my script, my role. Your role is to play the victim, and, you know, nothing personal in this, kid, sorry. He had a certain amount of charm and warmth. He was not a total monster.
He was a kind man. He liked other people all the time. He liked to be around people. But he had a passion for drilling or questioning an individual, and the harder the questioning became, the tougher he got. On many, many, many occasions, unfortunately.
I came to Harvard as an undergraduate in 1944, during World War II. I was quite young, I was 16. And I met a number of other undergraduates who were involved in political activities. I didn't realize that it was the Communist Party at that point. We would read and discuss Karl Marx and Engels, and occasionally go pass out leaflets in front of a factory gate or something like that. Nothing that really changed the world, I'm afraid. And no, we did not give the atom bomb to the Soviet Union. McCarthy, at the end of the hearing, must have said things like, I had been one of the most important people in the Communist Party, and I didn't deserve citizenship, and our boys were being slaughtered in Korea because of traitors like me.
McCarthy didn't come up with really a single name of a real Soviet spy. Were there Soviet spies? Yes, many. We now have their real names, and we have it straight from the KGB archives. He was a deterrent in the fight against communism. He was not a helper toward defeating communism, because he had this sideshow that was eventually, you know, a bitter joke.
I do think the committee should go to executive session and read this FBI report. You'll find, Mr. Chairman, that it states that an individual at the Signal Corps laboratory was in close touch with a Russian spy.
Prior to me going with the committee, the senator was in controversy with the CIA. And just days before I went there, he had asked for the subpoena of an official of CIA. And Allen Dulles refused.
The CIA as an institution came to abhor McCarthy because he accused the CIA of being subversive, which was insane.
The two organizations, even though they're in the same government and report to the same president, generally are very competitive with each other. In those days, J. Edgar Hoover certainly had very strong anti-communist feelings and very strong conspiratorial convictions.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Senator McCarthy had a very good relationship with Mr. Hoover, both socially and professionally.
And the misuse of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is one of the great shames of American democracy. And Hoover fed these people, like McCarthy.
I served in the FBI until 1953, and we tried to develop top functionaries within the Communist Party as informants for the FBI.
If you're old enough to remember Senator Joseph McCarthy, then you're surely old enough to remember Roy Cohn, then the 26-year-old chief counsel to the Wisconsin senator, who held hearings, some call them witch hunts, aimed, he said, at ridding the U.S. government of communists.
Roy Cohn, he was super smart and super manipulative and super out for himself.
I think that Senator McCarthy was, in many ways, dependent on Roy because he did not have the sources of information that Roy had, and also that kind of taking the leadership role, if you will, of what we would investigate and how we would investigate. Roy was the man behind the throne, so to speak.
Cohn was always there, like his detachable brain. You know.
When and where were you born?
I was born in New York City in 1927.
You're 26 years old
That's
now?
Right.
The charge of youth is justified.
Well, I plead guilty to that. I will say this, though, in mitigation of punishment, number one, I don't think it's my fault, and number two, since the charge has been made, I've been trying to figure out what I can do about it, and I haven't come up with an answer yet.
And one of my favorite recollections of Roy Cohn is that we were in the cub room of the Store Club, which is a very famous inn place, a social place for the glitterati of New York City. And Roy looked up and said, "I'd like an iced tea." Now, I have never seen 4 waiters make 1 glass of tea in my life. First, somebody had the ice, poured in the hot tea. Then somebody else squeezed the lemon. Then somebody else poured in the sugar. Then the 4th waiter stirred it for Roy. And he was not paying much attention to this. He was talking about what was happening, going on.
He's the only person in my whole life who I refused to shake hands with. It had not just to do with McCarthy, but everything else I knew about Roy Cohn. It also had to do with his law practice in general and his viciousness.
I met Jean certainly before they were married. I don't know what Jean ever did for the committee. That was before I went to the committee. But she had a tremendous impact on the senator. She was a very brilliant lady in her own right.
She attacked me. I know what you want. You want to get something on Joe, and you'll make up anything. You'll make up any lie you can think of and things like that. And she was very tough and very defensive. She was almost as bad as he was, except she wasn't as bombastic.
They knew Mrs. McCarthy, who was 14 years younger than her famous groom, is a storybook bride who captures the hearts of onlookers in front of the cathedral. Then on to the reception where Joe and Jean do the honors with a king-sized wedding cake. Best wishes to bride and groom.
You know, Joe recently said to me that he was unimportant as an individual in this fight. You know, I'll have to admit to you as his wife that I don't completely agree with him on that.
Jean confided in me more than once that she was concerned about Roy Cohn's influence on the senator. She got to where she did not like Roy.
There were some rumors, just rumors at this point, about Roy Cohn's sexual preference.
G. David Shine was also in his 20s when he worked for the McCarthy Committee.
If you look at these two men, Roy Cohn was short, dark, not particularly athletic, and David Shine was very tall, very blonde, a very good-looking guy.
Shine was, you know, just a spoiled brat whose father owned some hotels somewhere in America. Cohn looked like he was up to no good.
Cohn and Shine, his two assistants, he sent them off, and they're going to look for communists in American libraries all over Europe, and they made the laughing stock of themselves. And that did not help McCarthy's position.
Right, I think that's very good. We are here to gather information, to double-check leads we have, and to see a vast number of individuals.
We know that communists writing about the United States under the communist line to lie about the United States are not giving the true picture. And I don't think we have a right to give the German people or any other people a false picture of life in the United States and the American way.
Well, the reaction to Cohn and Shine by the European press was, I mean, they were appalled at what Cohn and Shine were trying to do, and they found it hard to take them seriously once they saw them, because they looked so incompetent and unqualified, and they kept asking themselves, why would the Americans pay any attention to these two kids? Cohn and Shine were going to London, and the British press especially wanted to pursue the case. I asked the ambassador, who was a friend of mine, so we gave a selected few the flight number, and they were met in a most hostile interview you could imagine. And I think they canceled their trip to that night. I mean, I think they just went right on back to America.
Why do you think your trip got such a bad press, both here and abroad?
Well, that's not for me to judge. I suppose the press is entitled to say exactly what it wants. There was a good deal of misrepresentation as to the purpose of the trip. Certain elements within the State Department over in Germany put a tail on us, whose job apparently it was to feed all sorts of information and stories to the hostile press. I suppose that's part of the game.
The McCarthyism, it was a very important thing in our country at that time. I did not think that the individual was particularly important. And I thought that for any president to take him on as you might say, an ideological opponent would end up only by increasing his publicity value.
I wish that Eisenhower had taken a stronger stand against McCarthy, but in fact, Eisenhower not only leaned over backwards, he actually caved in to McCarthy's pressures. And McCarthy was basically able to push Eisenhower around politically until the Army-McCarthy hearings weakened him. Until that point, I don't think Eisenhower had the political courage or the political strength to really combat McCarthy.
The division between the Eisenhower White House and Joe McCarthy was fierce. Eisenhower loathed Joe McCarthy. He thought he was a danger to American democracy. He thought he should be defeated. He wouldn't do it because he said, I'm not going to get down in the gutter with that guy.
Nixon's role in all of this was that once the Republicans got elected, it was his job to call McCarthy off. And he tried, and it didn't work. McCarthy had to be controlled. Alcohol is an important part of all this, too.
In addition to the 800 million in communist chains in Europe and Asia, the communists have gained a potential military base here in our half of the world, in Guatemala.
Senator McCarthy looked upon the Army McCarthy hearings, as a lot of us did, as a hatchet job. Was initiated by a famous meeting that was conducted in the office of the Attorney General of the United States, I believe on January the 21st of 1954. On that day, a conspiracy was started to get Senator McCarthy. At that meeting, beside the Attorney General of the United States was Sherman Adams, Chief of Staff of the Eisenhower White House, Bill Rogers, Deputy Attorney General, John Adams, and Henry Cabot Lodge, our U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. I believe that the President of the United States himself knew what was happening.
Finally, there is a showdown between McCarthy and the United States Army. A Senate subcommittee holds public hearings into the Army-McCarthy controversy. Each day, television brings the battle to 20 million viewers across the nation. It is one of the most extraordinary spectacles in the history of American politics.
The charges were, did Senator McCarthy and two members of his staff use improper pressure for Mr. David Schein with the Army? The countercharge was that there was blackmail on the part of the Army and the use of Mr. Schein as a hostage.
So much of the Army-McCarthy trap that McCarthy fell into that brought him down, that ruined him, stemmed from the fact that Roy Cohn was a homosexual who was in love with G. David Schein.
I said, let's talk about Schein. And that started a chain of events, an experience similar to none which I have had in my life. Mr. Cohn became extremely agitated, and he became extremely abusive. I pointed out to him that the national interest required that Schein be treated just like every other soldier. And he responded with even more force, we'll wreck the Army.
I do not remember saying any of those things the way Mr. Adams has them.
And as I get it now, you're saying that you have no recollection of it.
No, sir. I say I do not recall having said that.
Well, that's what I get your answer
yes,
to be
sir.
now. You don't recall having said it.
No, sir.
But you don't deny it.
Sir, I'm saying I did not say that. I am sure
All right, now you're saying you did not say it, Mr. Cohn.
Yes, sir. I say I am sure that I did not make that statement, and I am sure that Mr. Adams and anybody else with any sense, and Mr. Adams has a lot of sense, could not ever believe that I was threatening to wreck the Army or that I could wreck the Army. I say, sir, the statement is ridiculous.
And this was one thing that the power of television at its best, it could not diminish what people saw. It wasn't faked. It wasn't created. You were seeing it as it happened, and it was frightening and devastating.
Mr. Cohn, what is the exact number of communists or subversives that are loose today in these defense plans?
The exact number that is loose, sir?
Yes, sir.
I don't know.
Roughly how many?
I can only tell you, sir, what we know about.
Well, that's 130, is that right?
Yeah, I remember exactly what I said. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. I'm going to try to particularize for you if I can.
I'm in a hurry. I don't want the sun to go down while they're still in there if we can get them out.
Now, Mr. Welch made a statement. I raised the point of order that it was not a proper point of order.
I don't think that he recognized when things were turning against him. He kept on rambling on and on about point of order, and so on. And clearly the audience was losing all sympathy with him.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
He is censured on December 2nd, 1954, by the United States Senate. People are turning their backs on him. The reporters are laughing at him. He's invited no place. He gives a talk at Boscobel and nobody comes.
Oh, we were all delighted at his downfall. We were rubbing our hands to you know, how does America get rid of somebody like that?
The Senate committee considering charges against Senator McCarthy ends almost a month's proceedings in Washington, finding their fellow senator acted in a manner they call contemptuous and reprehensible. Senator Watkins of Utah headed the committee, which heard so much testimony it takes this cart to carry it.
I feel no different tonight than I did last night. I am very happy to have this circus ended so that we can get back to the work of digging out communism, corruption, treason in government. That job will start officially Monday morning after 10 months of forced inaction.
He crumbled at the end of his life, you know. He just sort of lost all confidence. It's like the wind went out of his sails, and that everything that had propelled him sort of disappeared. And he was a kind of a wreck.
Cardinal Spellman, who was a friend, helped him and Jean adopt a child in the last months of his life, and they thought if he had somebody like a child to live for, he could control it, and it didn't work. At one point in the Senate cloakroom, he came in, and there were some senators sitting there drinking, and he pulled out a glass and a big bottle, and he said, "The physicians tell me that if I take another drop, I'll die." And he filled up the glass and drank it down and left the room. Joe McCarthy committed suicide.
The phone rang, and we had just like started dinner. I'm not even sure what exact time he died, but someone called, and the phone was in the other room. We were in the kitchen, and my mother said, "Oh no, no," in disbelief.
You know, when a politician dies, his 99% of his colleagues attend, but nobody cries. And most of them forget right away. That's politics.
Well, you can say that's the fate of populists. They die by they live by populism and die by populism. At the time, I was surprised that it happened so quickly.
I have to make a confession. It's not a very nice thing, hearing that Senator McCarthy had died. It's a nasty thing to say, but I think I felt about time.